Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, I'm joined by Paul D.B. Watkins, professor of English at Vancouver Island University. Paul is the author of Soundin Canaan, Black Canadian Poetry, Music, and Citizenship, a uniquely researched and presented monograph that, while distinguishing aesthetics from rhetoric, traces a line from Black Canadian poetry through music to describe Black Canadian life, experience, and citizenship. A DJ himself, Paul mirrors the remixing and sampling methods used by musicians to enhance his research with samples of poetry, literature, interviews, and cultural elements, and even an accompanying playlist, to more deeply portray Black life in Canada. The title is published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. Before we get started, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. In this first episode, Paul explains his distinction between aesthetic and rhetorical functions of poetry and music, the meaning behind the book's title, and how the ideas of canon and genre relate to the development of Black Canadian poetry. Okay, Paul, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. So your book focuses on drawing a clear distinction between aesthetic and rhetorical functions of poetry and music. Why did you make this distinction, particularly when discussing Black poets and artists?
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. So for me, poetry at its core is a form of truth-telling. It's a way of speaking that's charged with meaning and urgency. So one of the poets I look at, Dionne Brand, she has described poetry as some way of getting at the core of things, a perfect kind of speech. And that definition really resonates deeply with the poets that I look at in the book, Soundin Canaan. So those poets are George Eliot Clarke, Dionne Brand, Amner Bessie Phillip, Canon, and Wade Compton. And they all engage poetry as a means of pursuing both beauty and justice. So while rhetoric and aesthetics are often treated as separate realms, one concerned with persuasion and politics, the other with form and feeling, these poets insist that the two belong together, right? So when read and sounded in conversation, their work shows how beauty and justice they're not just compatible, but they're co-constitutive. That is, I think, that's one of the key truths, really, that's running throughout the book, that poetry becomes a space where the demands of justice don't diminish beauty, but actually deepen it. It enhances it. So the dynamic, it's not just present in the poetry in the book as well, but it's alive in the music as well, right? So from blues to hip hop. And at one point in the book, I quote from jazz drummer Max Roach, who was asked in an interview what he thought about Black artists sampling non-Black sources. And his response, aside from calling the interviewer, Frank Owen, a mother effer, not sure what I can say on this podcast, was basically that the militancy is in the rhythm of hip hop, right? He said something along the lines of, I never heard Led Zeppelin swing. So in other words, the aesthetic itself is political. Sampling becomes a rhetorical gesture, just like the structure of a poem. It's designed to carry both meaning as well as argument. So more basically, right, we can think of, there's meaning that's carried in sound as well. And I think this is a balancing act that the poets do particularly well as the musicians I bring into the mix to hold beauty and justice together, right, in the same breath. It's, a difficult balancing act. And, as Audre Lorde reminds us, poetry is not a luxury. And I think that sort of rings true for many Black Canadian and Afro-sporic poets, that it's a necessity, right? It's an actual practice of survival and resistance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's reciprocal too, right? Like I feel like the aesthetic enhances the rhetorical as well. The beauty can kind of I guess, extend the impact, I guess, of the rhetorical part of, the political part of what they're saying.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah. So you write in the introduction, or the overture, as you call it, that the book title comes from the code name often used for Canada in spirituals during the Black migration. How did you settle on that title, and how does it relate to Black Canadian poetry's movement across borders?
So the title, Soundin Canaan, it's doing a few things at once.
Mm-hmm.
So both historically and metaphorically. So of course, Canaan originates in the Bible, right? It's the promised land. It's also a name for Western Palestine. It's often associated with a kind of spiritual deliverance or heaven. African diasporic cultures, especially in the US, took up this imagery and transformed it. So Canaan becomes a symbolic, essentially, of freedom, especially freedom from slavery. And in the context, and in that particular context, it was often used as a code name for Canada by those fleeing bondage via the Underground Railroad. And Canada is not innocent, right? In all of this, slavery existed here, wasn't abolished until 1834, but Canada came to represent, at least in the imagination of many enslaved people in the U.S., a kind of refuge. I think one historian, Robin Winks, estimates somewhere around, I think, 30,000 fugitives made their way north between about 1830 to 1860. So in the spiritual sung right during that migration, Canaan land became like a coded way to speak about Canada, both as a literal destination as well as a metaphor for liberation, right? And again, to reiterate that being said, Canada wasn't some post-racial utopia, right?
Yeah.
Many white Canadians view Black refugees as outsiders, tolerated more for their presence, which allowed Canada to claim moral high ground over the U.S., right? I think more than any sort of genuine commitment to racial justice. Right? Canada, after all, is a colonial state built on Indigenous dispossession and genocide. Yet, even within that settler framework, Black communities carved out spaces of survival and resistance, right? Their own Canaans, essentially. And these weren't perfect places, but they were meaningful ones. So my book tries to, again, it's that balancing act, tries to both celebrate that legacy while also interrogating the structures that contained it. So the idea of Soundin Canaan, I think it's that layered dynamic relationship, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sounding is intentional, right? It singles action, noise, vibration, movement. It's about making space. It's about being heard and felt. And Black Canadian poetry has always moved across borders. And so the title reflects that cultural motion. It's not static. It's a place of tension. It's a place of struggle and longing. It's a sonic space. It's a place of hope. It reverberates with voices that aren't always being given, right, the attention that they deserve. And early on, one of the books I read was James H. Cone's The Spiritual and the Blues, which was fairly formative for me in thinking about how song has functioned as a survival strategy and as a means of expressing Black interiority. So Cone traces how spirituals use biblical tropes like Canaan to encode messages of resistance and hope. And I also found Wade Compton's book, After Canaan, really influential as well. It posed the question of what happens after that arrival and how the mythos of Canaan still lingers in Black Canadian thought and literature. Ultimately, I kept encountering this term in the poets I was reading, and also in songs and in writings across time and place. And so the book traces that dialogue, but also that echo, that ongoing sounding. It's about listening to how Black poets and communities have made meaning, right, of this land, not just as geography, but as metaphor, as history, as remix, as an unfinished product.
Yeah. So the Canaan reference still has a contemporary usage, I guess, as well as, historical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So you noted that while you work within the confines of genre, you resist the, quote, dangers of canon formation. Can you expand on that? How do the ideas of canon and genre relate to the development of Black Canadian poetry?
Yeah, and there's a lot of ongoing debate, by critics around this particular issue.
Right.
In his 2002 work, Odyssey's Home, again, an early work that I encountered in grad school, sort of going through this process and looking at the history, the poet and scholar George Eliot Clarke, he makes the case for an existence of an African-Canadian canon that stretches all the way back to 1785. Mm-hmm. So we're talking about like early settler narratives, religious tracts. And he argues that these early texts, they disrupt the perception that, Black Canadian literature only consists of maybe a couple writers like Austin Clarke and Dion Brand. And perhaps we could add Clarke into that mix. He was, he certainly got a lot of attention, certainly in since that book, as he, became Canada's poet laureate for a period of time there. And so, since Odyssey's home, there's been a wide range of archival material, so often in the form of anthologies and surveys of Black Canadian literature and cultural production, usually published by Black Canadian writers. So these collections also emphasize an expanding canon, right? So documenting the sheer breadth of work by Black Canadian writers. We get a lot of poetry, particularly in the 1970s. And so I think anthologists, they some of the work there is to preserve this material for future generations. So in the sense, canon formation has value, right? It traces Black agency. It traces a tradition. As I mentioned, right, some of those early writings are sermon settler narratives. And, we can sort of, don't want to get into an argument of what constitutes literature, right? But certainly they constitute importance. Yes. So the real significance lies in how they assert presence. They also challenge the notion of Canada as a white settler nation, right? A notion that's been sort of, continually reinforced since the beginning. And at the same time, right, I'm mindful in the book, I quote from Cornel West, right, who's he warns us about that, canon formation reveals the worst of academic pluralist ideology. Right. I think he has a point, right? As an academic, I know that canons are part of how institutions operate, and often they're exclusionary by design. So the challenge is, how do we make room for new entries? How do we disrupt dominant narratives that hold too much sway? And, my goal in the book was not to establish some new, like, rigid canon of contemporary Black Canadian writers. Rather, it was to draw attention to the power of Black voice and song in Canada. Voices that often dialogue or that are reworking canons themselves, right? And I think some writers that I look at would be sort of uncomfortable being placed like in a contemporary canon for all sorts of reasons, right? And I think that's why, I try to do things in the book. Like I begin each chapter with a listening exercise. That's a kind of sonic entryway that resonates with the poets under discussion. I make links between musical genres and poetic practices because the poets are very direct about this in the work. And at the same time, I resist narrowing things down too much, right? Because, I think there's always some danger of essentialism and mapping one genre onto one writer, right? That itself is kind of something I worry about in the book as well. So I try to disrupt my own impulses towards canon making, even while I'm sort of self-aware and self-reflexive. Oh no, I'm doing this a little bit. So, ultimately I'm trying to work in the service of highlighting the beauty, right? The range, and the force of the words and the sounds that I'm engaging with, right? And the reality though remains that Black Canadian literature, music, and broader cultural production are far less recognized than they should be. So in some ways, I hope the book is just a small intervention towards changing that, towards asking the readers and listeners to give this work some of the attention and appreciation that it deserves.
You just heard from Paul D.B. Watkins. Paul is a professor of English at Vancouver Island University and the author of Soundin Canaan, Black Canadian Poetry, Music, and Citizenship, available now through Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. Join us next week when we talk about how Paul's DJ work directly influenced the writing of the book, how he decentered himself during his research, and how that relates to white scholars writing about Black literature, art, and culture. Remember, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. The Authority File podcast is brought to you every week by a small but extraordinary team, including Choice's advertising manager Pam Marino, digital media producer Sabrina Kofer, and digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.